everyone, welcome back to my embroidery tutorials. We are currently sewing through my 90 variation chain stitch sampler, which you can find the pattern for on my Etsy shop. We are currently on the second circle, which means we are working on stitches numbers 16 through 30. This is 15 new variations on chain stitch. We're going to get into fly stitch and detached fly stitch variations on this circle, and today we're starting with a few variations of chain stitch itself, how to use chain stitch as a fill for a larger space, as well as two of my absolute favorite variations, heavy chain stitch and Hungarian braided chain stitch. So I hope you go grab a pattern and follow along as we learn some new stitches. Thanks for joining. So chain stitch is commonly thought of as an outline stitch because it is clearly a straight line here, unlike something like satin stitch. However, it is a great fill stitch, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. We've already covered regular chain stitch, both forward and reverse, in a previous video, and I'll link that up in the corner. So if you're unsure of how to do chain stitch, feel free to go check that out. Now there's a lot of options for how to use chain stitch, and you don't have to just leave it as an outline. It actually adds some great texture and depth to an entire shape if you'd like to fill something in with it. So we're going to talk about how to use that single line of chain stitch to cover a shape without leaving too much open space, without being able to see light or see that background fabric through your stitches. You can use either forward or reverse when you're doing this. I'm going to be using forward here just because it's my favorite, it's my go-to. I most commonly do it. And I will note that if you're filling in a shape like this one here that has any sort of point on the end, then forward could be more helpful, as you're going to get that thicker part of the teardrop away from the point, and the little pointed end of the teardrop on that first stitch will fit perfectly into the pointed end of your shape. So you can really kind of play around with what your shape looks like and how that's going to relate to your stitches to decide if you're going to do forward or reverse, or quite frankly, you could do a combo of both. There's a couple things to think about when you're going to be filling up a shape with chain stitch. First of all, you should decide if you're going to be alternating your rows or not. So you could stitch in one direction all the way down the side of your shape, and then you can turn around and stitch in the other direction to create your next row, and so on and so on. So you're going back and forth. That means your teardrops of the chain stitch itself are going to be opposite of each other in each line, and they'll kind of fit into each other pretty well if you plan it out. However, that's not necessarily something you have to do. A different looking texture will derive of putting them in the same direction. So you could also start your next line doing a reverse chain stitch, which would put you in the same direction, all of your teardrops facing the same way as you go back and forth in those rows. Or you could even jump back to the beginning of whatever your shape was. If you're doing something circular, you may end up going in a spiral and doing the exact same direction of chain stitch for the entire thing. So lots of different options there. Just kind of think about which one is going to give you the texture that you want, or play with a couple different options. You can even do that in this shape itself. You could do half in one direction, half in the other, or half in one direction and then half alternating, whatever you would like to do so that you learn the most from it. The next decision you can make is whether you're going to fill up your shape from one side to the other, or from the outside in, or even from the inside out. I don't typically do the inside out just because you're not quite sure where your rows are going to land, but I have used both the other ones just depending on my shape. So I will say, if you're trying to do outside in, so that's basically what I've done with this shape here. I've gone ahead and stitched both of the outside rows, and then I'm alternating on one side and then the other. So it's kind of like I'm doing the outline over and over again until I get to the center. One thing that can happen if you're doing that though, and this has happened to me before, when you get to the very last row, if you don't have quite enough space for it, that last row of stitches may end up a little raised off of the fabric because they're sitting halfway on top of the stitches around them, and then it'll just be noticeable. So I did that once while filling in a shape. My last row of stitches just didn't quite fit into the gap that was left over, and therefore it was slightly raised off the fabric. Now, does that really matter? No, it doesn't. However, it is something that, as a bit of a perfectionist, I continue to notice every time I looked back at that piece. So if you want to avoid that, then I would suggest starting from one side of the shape, unlike I'm doing here, and going all the way to the other side of the shape. That'll also give you a different texture around the edges as far as where the ends are meeting. And that's another great thing to play with, is what the outside is going to look like. If you want those two smooth outlines without any breakage in them, then working from the outside in can be a better option. As you move to the next row, really consider where you're starting your first stitch of each continuing row. If you overlap this stitch slightly with the last one, a lot of times that's going to look better than just starting to the side. Consider that your shape is not completely straight. This isn't a completely straight line. It has a rise and a fall to it because there's a thin end to the teardrop and a thick end to the teardrop. So if you are putting a thin teardrop end near a thick one, you might want to just put it a little bit on top of that one rather than to the side of it, and that's going to prevent you from having any gaps, and it's going to make your edges look better. So yeah, I guess ultimately my advice here is, if you're going to be filling in a shape with chain stitch, play around with your different textures, consider your different options before you start, because if you're like me, you probably hate tearing out stitches. I absolutely hate undoing anything I've done. So think it through before you start. Think about how those different stitches are going to look depending on the direction, depending on where you start and end, depending on how much overlap there is. And if you really want to avoid having much of that background fabric showing, or if it's going to be hanging up near a window and you don't want too much light shining through from the back, you just want to make sure that each new line of stitches is right up next to the one before it. Don't leave any gaps there. Don't be afraid to cram those stitches together. They will fit more than you think. So the closer your stitches are, the more filled in your space is going to get. Now granted, it could also look really cool to do a fill stitch that is not so crammed together, especially if you're using a thicker thread, like all 6 strands or a pearl cotton. If they're using these bigger threads and doing like a thick, chunky chain stitch with them, it could look really cool to be able to see the fabric through, to be able to get light through that. So that's also an option. The fun part about embroidery is there is no really perfect way to do things. It's all about what looks best to you and what you have fun doing. All right, next up we are talking about heavy chain stitch. I absolutely love this stitch. It gets a nice sort of thick textured look to it, and so it's great for an outline that you want to be chunkier or more vibrant, just stand out a little more from the background. We're basically sewing this like you would a reverse chain stitch, but we're going to be doubling up the stitches as we go. So for this, we're going to start by making a tiny stitch at the front of our line. Now you don't necessarily have to start by doing this tacking stitch, but this is a tip I got somewhere and I wish I could remember who gave it to me. I can't, I'm sorry. I appreciate it though. But doing that tacking stitch first is going to ensure that both of your first loops are really held down well. If you try to do your first stitch like you would do a lazy daisy and then add your second stitch through that original loop, there's a chance you could sort of pull up on that loop. It'll want to pucker towards the end of your chain, and it just won't lay as flat as it should. This was a great tip. I loved it. Tack down first. Create your tacking stitch first, and then create the loop that goes through it. And then you're just going to move about a half stitch length away. So each complete stitch here is actually made up of 2 stitches, sort of like the layered ones that we did on our last circle. So after you've created that first stitch, you're just moving a little bit away, coming up through the fabric again, and then you're going through the exact same tacking point as the first stitch went through and back down in the same location. This creates this double stitch that really gives you a lot more texture. And as you continue stitching this line, you're always moving a half stitch length away, and then you're always going underneath the 2 stitches before that. So as I stitch this next one, it's going to go underneath both of the stitches that came before it. The stitch after that also goes under 2. So you can see this repetitive motion of going up 2 stitches instead of just linking with the last stitch like we normally do in chain. And this is how we get that really great texture. for a heavy chain stitch, you can either just finish off your stitch where it is and leave it. That's going to give you sort of a taper on the very end. Or if you want to keep that thick line all the way to the end and not have any sort of taper, then you'll just do your last stitch from pretty much the same point as the one before it. So wherever you went down for your last stitch, you want to come up just like a couple threads away, and then go through the 2 stitches prior and go back down. And that half stitch will sort of fill out your line all the way to the end so that you don't have any tapering. Last one for today. This is called the Hungarian braided chain stitch, or some people just call it the braided chain stitch. I think that title can get a little confusing because, as you'll see if you continue on to the end of the sampler, the term braid comes into a lot of different chain stitches. So throwing Hungarian there on the beginning really helps differentiate which stitch we're talking about here. Now, the Hungarian braided stitch is a lot like the heavy chain stitch. It's actually doing the exact same pattern with just a slight twist on how we're sewing that pattern. And in the end, that gives us this different texture. It's amazing. You can do just a slight change in how you're sewing something and you get a completely different look and texture out of it. So to sew the Hungarian braided chain stitch, we are again going to start by doing that little tacking stitch first, because our first 2 stitches are going to look exactly like the heavy chain stitch. We're creating a small loop that goes through that tacking stitch, and then a bigger loop that goes through the same tacking stitch. Now the difference here is our next stitch is not going to go underneath both stitches. It's only going to go under the smaller stitch, the first one. So rather than going under the 2 stitches prior, it's skipping the stitch right next to it and it's going under the stitch before that. So that's going to be our pattern as we continue. We're always skipping the stitch in front of us and going to the stitch before that one in order to create this fun raised texture. Now, I find the best way to do this without having to dig your needle and trying to separate all the threads from each other and trying to get only under certain ones. The best way to do it is to leave your needle underneath while you tighten up around it. So you can see as I stitch here, I'm leaving a little slack. I'm not pulling my stitch all the way tight. This allows me to see the hidden stitch from before. If I pulled this tight, the small stitch that I had done first would really get hidden underneath that second stitch, and I want to be able to see it. So I'm leaving some slack, and then I'm sliding my needle easily underneath that first stitch and leaving the needle there while I tighten up that slack. This is really just the easiest way to do it. It can be a bit of an adjustment to get used to leaving your needle there while you tighten the slack and then pulling it through and then leaving some slack and continuing this on. I quite often forget that I'm doing this pattern and I just pull it all the way tight, but it is definitely an easier way to do this stitch rather than trying to dig down there for that first stitch and only get those threads. So again, as you're pulling through your stitch, you're gonna leave some slack. Don't pull it all the way tight so that you can see that stitch underneath it. And then you're bringing up your needle 1 stitch length away, sliding it underneath that first stitch and leaving it there while you pull that slack tight. Then you can pull the needle through, but again, we're leaving some slack in preparation for the next stitch. Now to finish off this line, you can either just complete your last stitch and leave it how it is, or if you want to end at a certain point but still keep that thicker look all the way to the end, then rather than moving 1 stitch away, do your last stitch from the exact same point as the previous one. As you can see, I'm doing that here. It's just going to keep the texture going all the way to the end. So we're coming up in the same place or maybe just 1 or 2 threads away, and we're still completing the same pattern and going down here to make it look thick and smooth all the way to the end instead of tapering off. All right, and that was 3 ways that you can use chain stitch or vary chain stitch to give you some different textures and different designs. I hope you will try these out. I absolutely love these, so if you're gonna try out anything from this circle, these are my 3 favorites. You should try all the rest too, but these are definitely my favorites out of the circle. So give these a go. Let me know in the comments how it worked out for you or if you have any questions. And as always, thanks so much for joining us. I'll see you for the next tutorial.